Good evening. Tonight I'd like to talk about variances, specifically material and labour variances. Material which we can subdivide into price and usage variances, and labour which we can subdivide into rate and efficiency variances. When we introduce a new product, a standard cost card is drawn up. This details the expected cost of making the product. We can then use this information for a number of things. Planning our resource requirements, how many hours of labour do we need, how many kilos or litres of material, and so on. Deciding how much we need to sell the product for to cover our costs and maybe even make a little bit of profit. Further down the line, once we have started producing and selling our product, we can look at what it is really costing us in comparison with what the cost card tells us it should cost. If we see a difference, there's a lot of reasons that can happen. The market price may have altered due to a shortage or perhaps a surplus. We've often heard the example of a good coffee harvest, so the price of coffee falls, or bad weather in the Amazon and the price of coffee rises. Our employees on the production line may be working more or less efficiently than expected. It may well be that we simply got the standard wrong in the first place. So, quite a popular task in an assessment is to be asked to calculate the differences between expected results and actual results. And the name that we give to these differences is variances. If something should cost this, but it did cost that, the difference is a variance. We describe variances as either favourable, better than expected, or good news, or adverse performance, worse than expected. When we see a favourable variance, this may indicate that our cost is lower. Well, it must indicate that our cost is lower than expected, and therefore an increase to our profit. But that is in the short term, and there's an asterisk there, and we'll come back to that asterisk shortly. Adverse variances, on the other hand, show that our costs are higher than standard, and therefore our profit is reduced. More on that asterisk coming up. Now, a bit of a hint. When you're looking at costs, remember that less is better. If cost is lower than expected, that's favourable. On the other hand, you may be asked to calculate variances on income or profit. We have things like a sales variance. Now, when it comes to income or profit, more is better. So for that reason, don't look at the two figures side by side and try to say, oh, if the left's more, that's good, or is it bad on the right? You have to actually look at the figures and think about what they mean. Use your common sense and say, is this good news or is it bad news? We expect to pay £10 a kilo for our material. We've only paid £8. Well, it's got to be good news. It's cheaper than expected. This is much safer than trying to just mechanically lay out columns of figures and say, well, it's the left is high, so that's good, or whatever. It's very easy to fall into the trap of just mechanically taking one side from the other. And losing sight of the meaning. When we calculate a variance, we compare actual costs to a flexed budget. What do we mean by that? Well, if we plan to make 1,000 units and use 10,000 kilos of material to make 1,000 units, if we make, let's say, 1,100 units, then plainly we expect to use a lot more material. We expect to use 11,000 kilos of material. So when we're looking at how well used our material is or how badly, then we need to compare to that flexed figure. We rework all of the variable elements of the original budget to a new figure. We recalculate the costs in line with the actual amount we've produced, and that's what we mean by flexing a budget. And the example I've got here is 10,000 units, 5,000 kilos of material. That's half a kilo per unit, then plainly 12,000 units, we would expect 6,000 kilos. Difference in costs can also arise due to a change in the price. Not only the amount we use, as I mentioned, if the coffee harvest fails, the price of coffee will rise, and so on and so forth. Two questions we have to ask. How much material should we use for this many units? Nice, simple, plain English question. And then we compare that to the actual amount we've used, and we turn that into a monetary value by multiplying by the standard cost per kilo. And that is our usage variance. We're not interested at this point in actually the price paid. What we're interested in is the standard cost per kilo. The second question is, how much should we pay for this amount of material? So if we've bought 10,000 kilos and it's £10 a kilo, that's £100,000. Compare with the actual price. And if we've paid 108,000, well, that's 2,000 less than 110. That's a favourable price variance. So a worked example, our product needs 5 kilos. We normally pay £14 for a cost of a kilo, for 1 kilo of material. We aim to produce 10,000 units, but we actually make 10,500. But to make that 10,500 units, we actually use 52,000 kilos of material, and the total amount we pay for that is £780,000. So let's do some workings. 10,500 units at 5 kilos, we should need 52,500 kilos. Notice that's not the budgeted amount of material because we've made more units. We actually used 52,000 kilos, so immediately we can see we've saved 500 kilos, and at standard cost of £14 a kilo, we have saved £7,000, and it's good news. Therefore, a favourable usage variance, £7,000. Now, 52,000 kilos that we've bought, the actual amount that we've used at £14 should cost us £728,000. Now we'll deal with any difference in the price that we've paid. We actually paid £754,000 for something that should have cost £728,000. Obviously, that's bad news. An extra £26,000, an adverse price variance. Now, a useful exercise. We look now at the total cost against what the total cost should have been for that amount of units. Standard cost of 10,500 units, we should use 5 kilos each at £14. It should cost us £735,000. We know that our usage was a £7,000 saving because the amount we used was less than expected, but we know the price we paid was 26,000 more than expected. 735 minus 7 plus 26 tells us that that's an actual amount of paid of 754,000, which is indeed the amount that we paid. So we can see why our standard cost was different to what was expected. So we might want to investigate why we paid such a high price. There may be a link between these. It could be that we've paid a higher price, but it's a better material to work with, less wastage, so we've made a saving on usage. Often there will be links, and you may be asked to give possible explanations. The reason it's always worth doing this final reconciliation, checking that the figure of 754, for example, is indeed the actual, it just helps guard against making any mistakes in your workings. Now, let's look at labour. This time the two questions are, how many hours should it take for this many units? Not how many hours did we plan to work, because we're making possibly a different number of units. We compare that with the actual number of hours worked, and again, any difference between the standard hours for this many units and the actual hours, we multiply by the standard hourly rate. That gives us our efficiency variance. Next question we ask is, how much should we pay for the actual hours worked? So now this time, we're just looking at the number of hours worked, and then we compare that with the actual amount paid. And this is what we call the rate variance, the difference in cost due to the pay rate, the rate paid per hour. So, worked example again. Our product requires 1.5 hours per unit, and we pay a standard rate of £16 per hour. We produce 10,500 units. We actually work 14,200 hours, and for those hours we pay a total cost of £248,500. So the working's quite similar, a little bit different. 10,500 units that we've actually made should require 15,750 hours. That's how long it should take at 1.5 hours per unit. We actually worked only 14,200 hours. So plainly, we've worked a lot less hours than expected for the standard. That's a saving of 1,550 hours. Multiply that by the standard cost. That means we have paid £24,800 less for the number. We have incurred a cost of £24,800 worth fewer hours. So our efficiency is such that we have saved £24,800 worth of labour at standard rate. Now, 14,200 hours at standard cost, standard pay rate should cost us £227,200. We've actually paid £248,500. So plainly, although we have worked very efficiently and used fewer hours than expected, we've paid quite a considerable premium for those hours. And in fact, the difference is we've paid £21,300 more for those hours than the standard pay rate. This is bad news, paying more, an adverse rate variance. But once again, what we're able to do is reconcile what the standard cost should have been for that amount of product against what we spent, just to check that we've made no errors in our workings. Standard cost for that many units, we expect to spend £252,000. We saved 24,800 by being extra efficient, but we paid an extra 21,300 hourly rate. So overall, that takes us to the actual amount paid, 248,500. So our total labour variance is 3,500, the difference between the two. Now, I mentioned earlier, a little asterisk, there's a question, is a favourable variance always good news? You would think, well, yeah, if we've saved money, made it more cheaply, we make more profit. Well, if there's a reason for it, so maybe we've got a bulk discount, or I mentioned back to coffee again, a good harvest, so the price of our raw material has fallen. Nothing's changed, it's just as good as normal, so usual material, and for whatever reason we've been able to get a better deal. Great, then it is good news. When it comes to labour, somebody might have found a way of working efficiently. Or if we do 5 of these at once instead of 1 at a time, hey presto, we can get them out quicker, and they're just as good, no compromise on quality. So if that happens, great, good news. And hopefully that's something that can be passed on and replicated. And for future, what we can then do is have a standard that says we can make them quicker. But cheaper isn't always as good. Now, it could be that the quality of our product has been compromised. So, an example, most of us have done a bit of decorating in our time, I'm sure. If you're a paint manufacturer and your mixing's a bit sloppy and the colour's not the same as what's on the label, so somebody buys 3 tins of paint and then one of them is a different colour to the other two because somebody's, put a different amount of one pigment and it's a bit of a cheaper one. People are not going to be happy. They're going to, don't buy their paint. It doesn't come out the same colour. I've just had to do my living room twice over because of that and throw a lot away. What if the quantity of paint isn't as much as it should be? Our machine is calibrated slightly wrong. It's putting less in a tin. So we might get a fine because somebody buys a litre of paint, they expect a litre, not 970 cc's. So not good, not brilliant, and bad news. But it could be a lot worse. Now, bit of metallurgy. There's a big, well, there are several pieces of metal. Okay. Steel plates, and those are held together. These knobbly things that you see are rivets. They are hammered through 2 plates that overlap, and the rivets join the plates together and hold very tightly. All rivets are not equal. The quality of a rivets are graded A down to E, A being the best and E being the worst. And by the quality of a rivet, we talk about, I believe the word is ductility of the metal. That is to say, if you bash a good quality rivet, it can stretch and spring back and stay solid. If you bash a low quality rivet, it will break. So, as you can imagine, when you're joining sheets of metal together like this, depending on the usage of the metal, you will specify a certain quality of rivet. And for this particular construction, the design specification said that rivets of grade B or better were needed. So A's or B's were good enough. Anything less than a B was not good enough for the specification. Now, this was made a long time ago. And one slight foible of the English language is that B and D don't half sound similar. And possibly by accident, some grade D rivets were delivered to the manufacturer that made this steel plate instead of B. Worse still, it didn't get noticed or whatever, so they got used anyway. So we have this metal plate joined together with rivets of a lower quality and therefore less able to withstand a shock than the original design. This is actually a piece of a very well-known ship that was designed to cope with fairly substantial impacts, such as, for example, a big scrape along these panels from an iceberg. It should have scraped along, deformed the panels a bit. The rivets should have been strong enough to hold it all together. Can you see where this is going? Instead, engineers, many years later, which it is many years ago now, over 100 years ago, theory is that a number of rivets snapped that should have held. The plates separated, and if the side of a ship of steel plates separates, that lets in a lot of water. And the ship was called the Titanic. And that is currently the #1 theory as to why the Titanic did not survive the impact of the iceberg. So a favourable material variance, presumably due to the cost of the rivets being lower than they should have been. A saving there was a very expensive error. So what do we do about a variance? So life doesn't go the way we expect. Some things cost more, some things cost less. Well, First thing is we have to decide whether a variance is significant. If you've got, I don't know, a routine commodity, house bricks or something, and a house should need, I don't know, 22,000 bricks and a few more break than normal, and you use 22,010. That's very 10 bricks. Are we going to fuss about 10 bricks extra used? We may set a threshold. An assessment task may well say to you that a particular percentage, such as 5%, makes a variance significant. Now, when we say 5%, the calculation is the variance over the standard cost. So it's a percentage of the standard cost, not a percentage of the actual cost. An important distinction. In the real world, there's a bit more to it than that. Yes, we do have a threshold, but it's going to depend a little bit on the nature of the product. What if we've got a machine that has always been 100% totally accurate, never ever a variance, fantastic quality engineering? All of a sudden, it starts getting a variance, and it repeats it and repeats. It might well be that that machine is all set after many years of service to fail in a big way. So we may well investigate a very small variance. What about the item in question? Now, if we work at the Royal Mint, and 500 £10 notes are missing out of a print run of 1 million or so, well, 500 over 1 million is a very small percentage, but you can bet that this is not going to be ignored. Likewise, you know, if we've got a bulk consignment of diamonds and a gram or two goes missing, extremely high value. What if we're dealing with nuclear waste that we don't want to fall into the hands of people who might want to use it for nefarious purposes, or what we don't want is it to end up polluting our water table. So the nature of the product can make a big difference. What if it's safety critical? We've already had the example of the boat that sank, but in aviation, plainly, even one small washer that goes missing on an airplane could lead to catastrophe. So there, the tolerances are much, much greater in the real world. So we've investigated, we've identified a variance, we've looked into the cause of it. What do we do about it? And really, it depends. There are two possibilities. It was a one-off. Look at what happened during COVID a couple of years back. You know, pubs sales figures collapsed. So that wasn't something that was inherently wrong with the way they set the budgets. That was just a circumstance that nobody could have foreseen. Likewise, you know, lorry crashes into a shop front, so you can't open the shop for 3 months. That's not something you can budget for. It's a one-off. What do? You know, we put it down to experience. We're not going to say next year, right, when we do our budget for next year, do we need to allow for the fact that a lorry might crash into the shop? Alternatively, if a variance is a result of a permanent change, so for example, the price of our raw material is much dearer than it used to be, possibly a change to minimum wage would affect our labour, or we found a better way of working. I mentioned somebody's found a better way to work, so we train the rest of the team on this new method. So now we know that we can do produce our output with less hours, fewer hours than we used to before. So if it's a permanent change, something that is always going to be like that, then this is going to be reflected in the standard cost. And when we set the next budget, our expectations will be different. Well, thank you for your attentions. That's the end of the recording. I hope that's been useful. Well, good morning, good afternoon, good night, depending on when you are watching this.